Silence does not always mean consent. Sometimes it is the restrained roar of a storm gathering its strength, waiting for the right moment to break. It is the patience of a person collecting the shattered pieces of a betrayal, not to mend what was broken, but to forge them into a weapon. For Amelia Richardson, silence had been a language she understood well, a quiet space where memories and love were kept safe. But on this bleak Tuesday afternoon, a single piece of paper had shattered that silence forever, replacing it with a cold, ringing void. The letter arrived in an offensively thick, cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of a final judgment. It was not a notification, it was a verdict. Her eyes scanned the cold, sterile legal language, but her mind focused on only a few soul-crushing phrases: transfer of ownership, deeded in its entirety to Mr. David Richardson and his wife, Mrs. Clara Richardson. Effective immediately. Rosewood Manor, the sprawling New England home that had held the laughter of 3 generations of her family, the house where she took her first steps and held her father's hand for the last time, was no longer hers. It had been taken. And the final, brutal twist of the knife was the signature at the bottom of the authorizing document, a faint, shaky scrawl from her mother, Eleanor. A signature procured just 1 month prior, as the fog of dementia was beginning to claim the last shores of her memory. Amelia did not scream. No tears fell. To cry would be to acknowledge a wound, but this was not a simple cut. This was a poison seeping slowly into her veins, paralyzing her from the inside out. The betrayal didn't come from an enemy in the dark. It came from the 2 people who were supposed to be her closest allies, her brother and his wife. It came with the phantom scent of her mother's perfume clinging to the legal papers. She stood at her apartment window, watching the relentless autumn rain lash against the glass, washing the city streets clean. But no amount of rain could ever wash away the filth of this act. The cold void inside her began to solidify, hardening into something new. It was a promise, made only to herself, in the deafening silence of her stolen world. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a long, quiet, and deliberate reckoning. To understand the depth of the wound, you must first understand the beauty of the life that was stolen. Before the letter, before the poison, there was Rosewood Manor. It wasn't merely a house built of brick and ivy. It was a living, breathing archive of the Richardson family. It stood on a gentle hill in coastal Maine, its white facade softened by the salt-laced air, its windows looking out over the Atlantic like patient, knowing eyes. The heart of the manor was not its grand foyer or its crystal chandeliers, but its gardens. Specifically, the rose gardens that Amelia's father, Thomas, had cultivated with an artist's passion. Each bush told a story, from the deep crimson of the Mr. Lincoln that he planted on the day David was born, to the delicate blush of the new dawn that climbed the trellis on the day Amelia graduated. The air at Rosewood Manor smelled of old books, lemon polish, and the perpetual, gentle perfume of roses. It was the scent of home, of safety, of a world that was supposed to be unshakable. Amelia Richardson was the quiet soul of that world. With a historian's temperament and a daughter's devotion, she was the family's memory keeper. While her brother was out chasing accolades on the football field, Amelia was in the library with her father, tracing their lineage through dusty ledgers and faded photographs. She knew the story of the great-grandfather who built the house with timber from his own land, and the aunt who painted the watercolors that still hung in the hallway. After her father passed, her role as caretaker naturally shifted to her mother, Eleanor. It was a role she accepted not as a burden, but as a privilege. She would spend hours with Eleanor, listening to the same stories told 100 times, helping her label old photos, her presence a steady, comforting anchor as the tides of memory began to recede from her mother's mind. Amelia's love for Rosewood Manor was etched into its very foundations. She didn't see its market value, she saw its soul. She saw the pencil mark on the kitchen door frame, charting her height as a child, the worn spot on the armchair where her father read the paper every morning, the faint scratch on a window pane from a stray baseball thrown by her brother decades ago. To her, the house was priceless because it was her history, her identity. David Richardson, her older brother, was the son around which the family often orbited. He was charming, handsome, and possessed an easy confidence that made people want to please him. He was the golden boy, the prodigal son, and in their mother's eyes, he could do no wrong. But his shine was a surface-level polish. Beneath it lay a foundation of weakness, a lifelong habit of taking the path of least resistance. He loved Amelia, in his own way, but he loved admiration more. He loved the idea of being the lord of Rosewood Manor, the status it conferred upon him, the envy it inspired in his friends. He didn't cherish the house's history, he cherished its prestige. He would walk through the rooms not with reverence, but with a sense of entitlement. His presence a loud echo in spaces that were meant for quiet contemplation. He was not a bad man, not inherently, but he was a malleable one, a ship with a grand sail but no rudder, easily steered by the prevailing winds. And the strongest wind in his life was his wife, Clara. Clara was a masterpiece of social ambition. She had entered the Richardson family like a breath of fresh, fragrant air, seemingly the perfect match for David. She was beautiful, intelligent, and unfailingly charming. She doted on Eleanor, learning the precise strength of her tea, remembering the names of her long-forgotten friends, listening with rapt attention to stories she had already heard from Amelia a dozen times. To the outside world, she was the model daughter-in-law, a blessing to the family. But Amelia, the quiet observer, saw things others missed. She saw the way Clara's eyes lingered on the silver, a flicker of appraisal in her gaze. She heard how her compliments were always perfectly calibrated, designed to soothe an insecurity or encourage a certain line of thinking. Her interest in the family's history seemed less about appreciation and more about cataloging assets. She was a master manipulator, playing on David's desire for admiration and Eleanor's deep-seated pride in her son. Clara didn't just marry David, she saw him as the key to a kingdom, and she was determined to hold the throne with him as her willing and witless king consort. At the center of it all was Eleanor, the aging queen of this fragile dynasty. A woman of grace and tradition, she loved her children fiercely, but her love was not balanced. For David, her son, she had a blind spot the size of the Atlantic Ocean. His smallest achievements were magnified, his flaws excused as quirks. For Amelia, her daughter, she had a quiet, comfortable love built on assumption. She assumed Amelia would always be there, always be responsible, always be the steady one. She took Amelia's devotion for granted, not out of malice, but because Amelia had never given her a reason to do otherwise. As her memory began to fray at the edges, this dynamic became even more pronounced. She leaned on Amelia for the practicalities of daily life, but she turned to Clara for comfort and validation, for the sweet whispers that told her everything was fine, that her wonderful son and his perfect wife would take care of everything. She couldn't see the web being woven around her because the spider was telling her how beautiful it was. The family dinners in those last few years before the fall were a portrait of this fractured reality. David would hold court at the head of the table, telling loud, charming stories. Clara would sit beside him, a radiant smile on her face, refilling Eleanor's wine glass and steering the conversation with surgical precision. Amelia would sit opposite, watching the performance, feeling increasingly like a stranger in her own home. She remembered one evening, about 6 months before the letter arrived. They were discussing the rising costs of maintaining the estate. "It's such a tremendous responsibility," Clara had sighed, placing her hand on David's arm. "One day, when you two have to manage all this, you'll need to be so careful. You'll need someone with real financial sense to protect this legacy." She had looked at David with adoration, but for a split second, her eyes met Amelia's across the table. And in them, Amelia saw not warmth, but a cold, triumphant glint. It was a declaration of intent, a quiet promise of the war to come. At the time, she had pushed the feeling aside, blaming her own quiet nature for her suspicion. She didn't want to believe that the beautiful painting of her family was a forgery. But even then, she could feel the edges beginning to curl, the perfect image starting to peel away, threatening to reveal the ugly, raw canvas of greed and betrayal that lay beneath. The beginning of the end was not a thunderous declaration of war, but a quiet, creeping fog. It rolled into Eleanor Richardson's mind slowly at first, blurring the edges of recent memories. It started with small things, a forgotten name, a story told twice in the same hour, a moment of confusion in the familiar hallway of her own home. Amelia, with her patient heart, saw these moments as gentle warnings, signs to be more present, to offer more support. But Clara saw them as something else entirely, an opportunity. As the fog in Eleanor's mind thickened, obscuring the landscape of her life, Clara positioned herself as the solitary lighthouse, the only reliable beacon in the growing storm. She became the angel of the house, a role she played with chilling perfection. Clara's campaign was one of meticulous, insidious care. She was always there, a constant, soothing presence. She learned the rhythms of Eleanor's good days and bad days, knowing when to offer a warm cup of tea and when to simply sit in companionable silence. She would spend hours helping Eleanor sort through old button boxes, listening with what appeared to be infinite patience as Eleanor recounted the story of each button, often repeating the same details over and over. She cooked the meals from Eleanor's childhood, filling the house with the aroma of forgotten comforts. To any observer, to the visiting nurses, to the few friends Eleanor still saw, Clara was a saint, a daughter-in-law of unparalleled devotion. She was managing the household, she was managing Eleanor's appointments. She was, in her own words, taking the burden off of everyone else. And her favorite person to take the burden off of was Amelia. The isolation of Amelia was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, waged with whispers and well-meaning concern. When Amelia would call, Clara would often answer Eleanor's phone. "Oh, she's having such a peaceful nap, darling," she would say in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "I hate to wake her. Let's let her rest." When Amelia would drive up to Rosewood Manor for the weekend, Clara would greet her at the door with a strained, tired smile. "I'm so glad you're here," she'd begin, "but we had a very difficult morning. The doctor says routine is absolutely key. Any disruption, even a happy one like seeing you, can sometimes set her back for days." She framed Amelia's love as a liability, her visits as a source of agitation. She would report back to David later, her voice heavy with feigned sorrow. "I feel so badly for Amelia. She just doesn't grasp how delicate your mother's state island. She comes in with all her energy, and it's just too much for her." Slowly, methodically, she painted Amelia as the outsider, the well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful daughter who was too busy with her city life to understand the grim realities of daily care. Amelia, wanting only what was best for her mother, began to call less, to visit on a more rigid schedule, never realizing she was complying with the terms of her own exile. While one front of Clara's war was focused on pushing Amelia out, the other was dedicated to conquering David's conscience. Her campaign was fought in the intimacy of their bedroom, late at night when the world was quiet and his defenses were down. She would lay her head on his chest, her voice a soft murmur of worry against his skin. "David, honey, I was paying the bills for the estate today," she might start, "and it's getting so complicated. Your mother, bless her, she signed a check to the garden supply company twice. What happens if she makes a bigger mistake? What if some predator takes advantage of her?" She planted seeds of fear and doubt, nurturing them with a constant stream of worst-case scenarios. The theme was always the same: protection. They needed to protect the estate. They needed to protect his father's legacy. And always, the unspoken threat of Amelia loomed. "You know how Amelia is," Clara would sigh. "She's practical. She's not sentimental like you are. If managing the house becomes a financial burden, she might see selling it as the only logical option. Can you imagine a stranger living in your father's house?" She twisted David's love for his family into a fear of losing it and positioned herself as his sole ally in this noble fight. He wasn't stealing from his sister or manipulating his mother. In his mind, he was becoming the patriarch, the protector he always wanted to be. The idea of a power of attorney was introduced not as a weapon, but as a shield. It was a simple, practical tool, Clara explained. A piece of paper to simplify things, to allow them to manage the accounts and pay the property taxes without having to bother Eleanor with every little detail. "It's about giving her peace of mind," Clara insisted. When David hesitated, expressing concern about leaving Amelia out, Clara was ready. Darling, including Amelia would just complicate it. 2 signatures for every transaction? And she's 2 hours away? It's not practical. This is just for day-to-day management. Of course, we'll keep her informed of any big decisions. She promised transparency while actively plotting a complete takeover. She found a new lawyer, a friend of a friend she described as a specialist in elder estate planning. He wasn't the old family lawyer who had known the Richardsons for generations, the one who would have certainly called Amelia. He was a stranger, a hired gun with a smooth smile and no inconvenient loyalties. The signing itself was a quiet, civilized affair, staged on one of Eleanor's rare, lucid afternoons. Clara had set the scene perfectly. They sat in the sunroom, Eleanor's favorite spot, with a view of the withering rose gardens. A vase of fresh-cut flowers sat on the table. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, was gentle and avuncular, speaking in slow, simple terms about making things easier. David stood awkwardly by the window, his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of uneasy resolve. He had been convinced this was for the best. Clara sat beside her mother-in-law, a pillar of serene support, one hand resting gently on Eleanor's arm. For a moment, looking out at her gardens, Eleanor seemed to hesitate. Thomas always handled these things, she murmured, a flicker of the old strength in her eyes. Clara squeezed her arm gently. I know, my love. And David is just trying to be like his father. He wants to take care of you, just like Thomas did. She looked at David, a silent command in her eyes. He crossed the room and knelt by his mother's chair. It's okay, Mom, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he mistook for sincerity. This is just to help. I'm here. We're here. Eleanor looked at her son's earnest, pleading face, the face of the boy she had always adored, and her resolve crumbled. She trusted that face. With a trembling hand, she picked up the pen Clara offered her and signed her name on the line Mr. Davies indicated. The ink flowed onto the page, a dark stain of finality. In that moment, with that single shaky signature, Eleanor Richardson didn't just sign away a house, she signed away a daughter, and she signed the death warrant for the family she had built. After the lawyer had packed his briefcase and departed with a polite nod, Clara picked up the document. She held it in her hands, her back to David and Eleanor for a moment. Her expression of gentle concern melted away, replaced by the faintest, coldest flicker of triumph. The lighthouse had guided the ship exactly where she wanted, onto the rocks. The 2-hour drive to Rosewood Manor was a journey through a nightmare landscape of denial. Amelia clutched the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, the offensive cream-colored envelope lying on the passenger seat like a venomous snake. With every familiar turn, every landmark from her childhood that flashed past her window, a desperate voice in her head whispered, "It's a mistake, a clerical error, a terrible, horrible misunderstanding." She pictured the scene. She would arrive, show David the letter, and he would laugh, a bewildered look on his face, before calling the family lawyer to sort out the mess. Clara would apologize profusely for the scare. Her mother would be sitting in her favorite armchair, perhaps a little confused, but safe. This fragile hope was the only thing that kept her from pulling over to the side of the road and succumbing to the waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. The closer she got, the more the hope felt like a lie, a thin veil of sanity she had wrapped around herself. When she finally turned onto the long gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires sounded like bones breaking. The house looked the same, yet entirely different. The grand white facade seemed colder, more imposing. The 2 large terracotta pots, overflowing with red geraniums that had always flanked the front door, were gone, replaced by severe, minimalist planters, holding perfectly manicured boxwoods. It was a small change, an insignificant one, but it felt like a desecration, a scrubbing away of her mother's gentle, slightly chaotic touch. The change was pure Clara. Amelia took a deep, shaky breath and rang the bell. The door swung open, and there she was. Clara stood in the doorway, wearing a crisp linen dress, a picture of serene domesticity. There was no guilt in her eyes, no flicker of apprehension, just a mild, perfectly calibrated look of surprise. "Amelia," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "What a surprise. I wish you had called." She led Amelia not into the cozy family den, but into the formal living room, a space reserved for guests and holidays, a room of stiff furniture and polite conversation. David was already there, standing by the fireplace, staring into the empty hearth as if the answers were written in the soot. He looked up when Amelia entered, and in his eyes, she saw it all. The guilt, the weakness, the miserable resolve of a man who had already chosen his side. Her mother was nowhere to be seen. The sliver of hope Amelia had clung to during the drive evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of betrayal. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She held up the letter, her hand trembling just enough to betray the storm raging inside her. "I got this today," she said, her voice tight. "It says the house has been transferred to you and David. It says Mom signed it. I need you to tell me this is a mistake." Clara didn't even glance at the letter. She sighed, a soft, patronizing sound, and gestured to a nearby sofa. "Amelia, please, sit down. Let's not be dramatic. We knew this would be difficult for you to process." The sheer audacity of the words stole Amelia's breath. Clara's tone was that of a therapist speaking to a hysterical patient, her voice dripping with false empathy. "Your mother has her good days and her bad days. You know that." In one of her more lucid moments, she expressed how worried she was about the future of the estate. The taxes, the upkeep, it's a tremendous burden. She felt it would be too much for you, with your career and your life in the city. She wanted to simplify things, Amelia. She did this to protect you. It was a work of art, a stunning tapestry of lies woven with threads of truth. Every word was a calculated twist of the knife, painting Amelia as the absent daughter and recasting their theft as an act of selfless love. Amelia ignored her. Her eyes were locked on her brother. "David," she pleaded, her voice cracking, "look at me. Tell me what's going on. Don't let her speak for you. Tell me." David finally tore his gaze from the fireplace, but he couldn't meet her eyes. He looked at a spot on the wall just over her shoulder, his expression miserable. "Amy, it's for the best," he mumbled, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Mom, she hasn't been herself. We're here every day. We can handle things. It makes sense. It's what she wanted." He was parroting his wife's script, a puppet dancing on her strings. The realization hit Amelia with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just a bystander, he was a willing accomplice. The brother who had taught her to ride a bike, who had helped her with her homework, had stood by and watched as his wife stripped her of her home, her history, her mother. "I want to see her," Amelia said, her voice suddenly flat and cold. The time for pleading was over. "I want to see my mother." Now, Clara's placid mask tightened for a fraction of a second. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said smoothly. "She's had a calm day. We wouldn't want to cause any confusion or distress. I am not a guest, Clara. This is my mother's house, and I am going to see her." For a moment, they were locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, with another long-suffering sigh, Clara relented. "Very well. But if she becomes agitated, I'm holding you responsible." She led the way up the grand staircase, her every step a declaration of ownership. She found Eleanor in her bedroom, sitting in a chair by the window, a photo album open on her lap. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a heart-stopping moment, she looked like the mother Amelia had always known. Then she looked up, and the illusion shattered. Her eyes, once so sharp and full of life, were clouded with a gentle, placating vagueness. She smiled at Amelia, a sweet, polite smile meant for a stranger. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice soft. "Have you come to see the house? It's a lovely old place." Amelia felt the floor drop out from beneath her. She knelt by her mother's chair, taking her frail hand. "Mom, it's me. It's Amy." Eleanor patted her hand absently, her gaze already drifting back to the photos. "That's nice," she murmured. "Clara," she said, looking towards the doorway where the other woman stood watching, a silent, victorious sentinel. "This young woman is very kind. Did you offer her some tea?" The words were a final, definitive execution of Amelia's hope. Her mother wasn't just being manipulated. She was gone. She was a ghost in her own body, a gentle, smiling prisoner in a jail whose bars were forged from her own decaying memories. There was no one to appeal to. There was no one left to save. Amelia rose to her feet, a profound and terrifying emptiness spreading through her chest. She couldn't breathe. She turned and walked out of the room, past Clara, down the stairs. She didn't run. Her movements were stiff, robotic. She had to get out. As her hand touched the handle of the front door, Clara's voice, now stripped of all its syrupy pretense, cut through the air behind her. "I think it would be best if you didn't come back for a while, Amelia. We need time to establish a stable routine for Eleanor. Any disruptions would be unhelpful. We will call you if we need anything." It was an eviction notice, a banishment. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing the final closing of a chapter in her life. She walked to her car and sat inside, not starting the engine, just staring at the house that was no longer a home. The letter lay on the passenger seat. She picked it up, the paper no longer feeling like a snake, but like a shard of ice. The numbness was gone, burned away by the cold, clear, agonizing truth of the betrayal. It was complete, and in the ruins of her heart, a single, silent vow began to take root. The drive back to the city was a silent 2-hour funeral. Amelia's life, as she knew it, had died in that formal living room, and she was now its sole mourner, driving the hearse. The world outside her car seemed to be moving in slow motion, the colors muted, the sounds distant. Her small, tidy apartment, once a symbol of her independence and a sanctuary from the world, now felt like a prison cell. The four walls seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with the sheer weight of her solitude. For the first few days, she existed in a state of suspended animation. Sleep offered no escape, only fractured nightmares of her mother's vacant smile and Clara's triumphant eyes. She would wake with a jolt in the dead of night, her heart pounding, the silence of her apartment a roaring testament to her utter aloneness. During the day, she would sit on her sofa and stare at a crack in the plaster on the opposite wall, tracing its path with her eyes for hours, because focusing on that small, inanimate flaw was less painful than contemplating the gaping chasm that had opened up in her life. The first act of her new existence was a brutal, necessary amputation. Her phone would light up with calls from numbers she knew by heart. David. Unknown numbers she suspected were Clara. Aunts and uncles, likely calling with carefully worded questions, having already been fed Clara's saccharin, poisonous version of the story. Each ring was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of the web of lies that was now her family's official history. With a cold, deliberate resolve she didn't know she possessed, she blocked them all. One by one, the names vanished from her screen. David, her cousins, the woman who had been her mother's best friend for 40 years. It was a digital massacre of her past. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and strangely clean. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done, a silence filled with ghosts and wreckage, but a silence nonetheless. She was an island now, and she had pulled up all the bridges, choosing the desolation of isolation over the agony of their false sympathy. The full scope of the devastation revealed itself in cruel, incremental ways. A letter from the bank informed her that a joint savings account she held with her mother, containing a modest sum she had set aside for Eleanor's future care, had been closed, its contents transferred. The small monthly stipend her father's will had granted her from the estate's income was abruptly cut off. She discovered she had been removed as the beneficiary on a life insurance policy. It wasn't just the theft of a house. It was a systematic erasure of her place in the family, a financial excommunication designed to cripple her. For the first time in her life, she felt the gnawing, visceral fear of true insecurity. She had to break her lease and move to a smaller, cheaper apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. She sold pieces of furniture, books she had cherished, a simple gold locket her father had given her. Each sale was a small death, a shedding of a past that no longer belonged to her. She was adrift, stripped of her home, her family, and the very financial and emotional foundations upon which she had built her life. Grief is a corrosive acid. It eats away at you until either you are consumed by it or you find a vessel strong enough to contain it. For weeks, Amelia felt herself dissolving. Then, one rainy Sunday afternoon, while unpacking a box of old belongings, she found it. A framed photograph from a 4th of July picnic nearly a decade ago. In it, she, David, and her mother were laughing, their faces lit by the sun and pure, uncomplicated joy. Her father was behind the camera, and you could almost hear his voice telling them to smile. She remembered that day so clearly, the smell of freshly cut grass, the taste of watermelon, the comfortable warmth of her mother's arm around her shoulder. The memory, which should have been a comfort, struck her with the force of a physical assault. The laughter in the photo now seemed like a grotesque mockery. It was all a lie. The love she thought was unconditional had terms and conditions she had never been allowed to read. The sorrow that had been her constant companion for weeks suddenly flash-boiled into something else. It was an anger so pure, so cold, it felt like ice forming in her veins. The tears that had been perpetually welling in her eyes dried up, and in their place came a diamond-hard clarity. The victim died in that moment. The grieving daughter was gone. What was left was something harder, something colder, something infinitely more dangerous. Her anger did not manifest in screams or shattered glass. It was a quiet, internal fire that she immediately began to channel. As a historical archivist, her entire professional life was built on a foundation of patience, meticulous attention to detail, and the methodical reconstruction of narratives from fragmented evidence. She would now apply that same skill set to the singular, all-consuming project of her own life: justice. She went back to work with a ferocious, newfound focus. She had always been a good employee. Now, she became an indispensable one. She worked longer hours than anyone, took on the most tedious and complex archival projects, the ones no one else wanted. She found a grim satisfaction in imposing order on the chaos of the past, a satisfaction that bled into her own life. She was building a new identity, one that was not defined by her lineage as a Richardson of Rosewood Manor, but by her own merit, her own resilience, her own name: Amelia. Her life became a Spartan, disciplined existence. Every spare dollar was saved, invested, and accounted for. She sold her car and started taking the bus. The inconvenience, a small price to pay for the financial freedom it afforded. In the evenings, while other people her age were socializing, Amelia was studying. She took online courses in contract law, in real estate finance, in forensic accounting. She was arming herself, not with weapons of violence, but with weapons of knowledge, learning the language of the world that had been used to undo her. The soft, accommodating woman who had always sought to keep the peace was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt. The process was agonizing, a forging of the soul. The betrayal was the fire, heating her to an unbearable temperature. The lonely, silent nights were the hammer, beating her into a new shape. The cold reality of her situation was the water, quenching the heat and leaving behind something unbreakable. She was becoming steel. Looking at her reflection one morning, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes, once soft and gentle, now held a focused, unyielding glint. The pain was still there, she could feel it deep in her bones, a permanent ache. But it was no longer a wound. It was fuel. It was the engine that drove her every waking moment. The silence that had been imposed on her as a punishment had become her sanctuary, her training ground, and her most powerful weapon. She was no longer waiting for a storm. She was becoming one. Nearly 2 years had passed since the day the door of Rosewood Manor had closed behind Amelia, sealing her out of her own life. 2 years of a Spartan, monastic existence, of rebuilding her world on a foundation of sheer will. The raw, open wound of the betrayal had scarred over, leaving behind a hard, unyielding resolve. Her life was a fortress of routine and discipline, and she had systematically purged almost every relic of her past. Almost. In the back of her closet sat 3 cardboard boxes, filled with the last remnants of her father's office, old financial records, professional correspondence, blueprints for the gardens. She had taken them weeks after his funeral, long before Clara's coup, intending to sort and archive them properly. Now, the task felt like a final, painful archaeological dig into a lost civilization. On a quiet Saturday, she decided it was time. She put on a pot of coffee, opened the first box, and began the somber work of sorting through the ghost of the man she missed every single day. For hours, she worked in a focused silence, the only sound, the rustle of dry paper. She sorted documents into neat piles: tax returns, investment statements, letters from his colleagues. It was a mundane and melancholy task. Then, tucked inside a thick folder of old receipts from the 1990s, she found it, an anomaly. A single, folded piece of paper that didn't belong. It was a receipt for the annual rental of a safe deposit box at a small, independent bank in Portland, a city her father had rarely visited. The date on the receipt was less than a month before he died. Her archivist's mind, trained to notice the out-of-place detail, the thread that could unravel a hidden story, snagged on it. Why would her father, a man of meticulous habits who kept everything at the family bank, open a secret box in a different city just before his death? It was a question that hung in the silent air of her apartment, demanding an answer. The following week, armed with a certified copy of her father's death certificate and her own identification, she took a day off work and drove to Portland. The bank was an old, unassuming institution of granite and brass, a relic from a different era. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and filled with a low hum of anticipation that made her heart beat faster. Finally, after a series of signatures and a verification of the key she found taped to the back of the original receipt, a quiet, elderly clerk led her into the vault. The air was cold and still, smelling of steel and old money. He retrieved a long, slender metal box, its surface cool and unfeeling, and placed it on a table in a small, private viewing room before leaving her in absolute silence. For a long moment, she just stared at it. It was a time capsule, a final message from a man who had been gone for years, and she was suddenly terrified of what she might find inside. With a trembling hand, she inserted the key and turned it. The lock made a sharp, definitive click. The contents were sparse, arranged with her father's typical neatness. On top lay a small, leather-bound journal. It was not a diary, but a log of his thoughts and observations. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat, as she saw his familiar, precise handwriting. The early entries were what she expected: notes about the gardens, reflections on books he was reading, proud mentions of her and David's small accomplishments. But as she flipped towards the end, the tone began to change. An entry from the year David and Clara got engaged read, "David is happy, and for that I am grateful. Clara is a charming young woman, but there is a hardness in her eyes I cannot quite place. She looks at Rosewood Manor not with the love of a future daughter, but with the cool appraisal of an auctioneer." Another, a few months later, had a conversation with David about his future. His ideas sound less like his own, and more like echoes of Clara's ambitions. "I worry he is hollowing himself out to make more room for her." These words were a posthumous validation, a confirmation from the one person whose judgment she trusted above all others that she had not been wrong. She had not been paranoid. He had seen it too. Beneath the journal was a single, thick manila envelope. On it, in her father's bold script, was her name, Amelia, and underneath, a chilling instruction: "To be opened only when you feel our family is no longer a family." A cold shiver traced its way down her spine. He had known. Somehow, he had foreseen the ugly, grasping greed that would one day tear them all apart. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal. The letter inside was several pages long. She began to read, and it was as if she could hear his voice in the silent room, calm, loving, and deeply sad. "My dearest Amelia," it began, "if you are reading this, then my greatest fears have come to pass. I hope this letter finds you well, but I suspect it finds you in pain, and for that, I am so deeply sorry. I have always been proud of your quiet strength, your kind heart, and your clear eyes. I have also, to my eternal regret, been aware of your brother's inherent weakness, a weakness I fear I enabled." He went on to explain his fears about Clara's insatiable ambition and David's malleability far more directly than he had in his journal. Then came the revelation, a paragraph that made Amelia stop breathing. "The house, the beautiful, beloved house, is our heart, our history," he wrote. "But I have always known that a heart can be a target, which is why I took steps, long ago, to protect our family's future. The bulk of my true net worth, my investment portfolios, my liquid assets, the real engine of our family's security is not, and has never been, tied to the estate. I established a blind trust, managed by a separate firm in Boston, the year you were born. I have named it the Rosewood Trust. Amelia's eyes scanned the page frantically, her mind racing. The letter continued, laying out the details with the precision of a legal document. The trust was substantial, far more valuable than the house itself. And she, Amelia, was its sole, designated beneficiary. But there was a catch, a series of conditions, written with the foresight of a grandmaster playing a long game of chess. He had made the trust almost impossible for her to access under normal circumstances, to protect it from being seen as a divisible asset. She could only take full control as the sole trustee under a very specific set of circumstances. She read the critical clause 3 times, the words burning themselves into her memory. The beneficiary may petition the managing firm for full control upon providing irrefutable, documented proof of either a gross financial mismanagement of the primary family estate, Rosewood Manor, leading to its neglect or devaluation, or B, a demonstrable act of bad faith by another primary heir that financially or emotionally disenfranchises the beneficiary from her rightful, though not necessarily equal, inheritance. She lowered the pages, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a perfectly designed legal trap, a ghost in the machine waiting for a trigger. Her father had not left her defenseless. He had left her an arsenal. The years of quiet suffering, of meticulous saving, of arming herself with knowledge, it all suddenly clicked into focus. She had been preparing for a war, not knowing that her father had already built her a fortress and supplied her with the cannon. The vague, formless desire for revenge that had been simmering inside her now had a name and a clear, brilliant path forward. She didn't need to sue them. She didn't need to confront them. She needed to let them do exactly what their greedy, incompetent natures dictated. She needed to give them enough rope, and her father's trust would be the gallows. A cold, electrifying calm washed over her. The plan was no longer a dream. It was a blueprint. Amelia carefully placed the letter and the journal back in the box, closed the lid, and walked out of the vault. The air outside the bank, once heavy and gray, now seemed sharp and full of light. The weight of her mission was still there, but it was no longer a crushing burden. It was the steady, reassuring weight of a weapon, held firmly in her hand. The hunt had begun. While Amelia was quietly forging herself into a weapon of precision and patience, a very different story was unfolding at Rosewood Manor. For David and Clara, the first year of their reign was a golden age of self-indulgence. Having secured the grand prize, they behaved like lottery winners with no concept of finance, believing the well of their newfound wealth was bottomless. Clara immediately began a campaign to erase every trace of Eleanor's, and by extension, Amelia's presence from the house. She called it modernizing, but it was an exorcism of taste. Antique furniture that had been in the family for generations was sold off and replaced with stark, white leather sofas and glass tables that looked perpetually out of place in the warm, historic rooms. She ripped out the chintz curtains her mother-in-law had loved and installed severe, remote-controlled blinds. The house, once a cozy repository of memories, began to feel like the lobby of a high-end, soulless hotel. They threw parties, of course, lavish, ostentatious affairs designed to announce their arrival as the new power couple of the coastal elite. Champagne flowed, caterers bustled in the kitchens, and a string quartet played on the back lawn. For a time, it worked. People came, drank their champagne, and complimented Clara's bold design choices. David, finally feeling like the master of the manor he had always believed he should be, was in his element, holding court, telling charming stories, soaking in the admiration he craved. Clara was the perfect hostess, gliding through the crowds in expensive dresses, her smile never faltering. They were performing the role of the landed gentry, and for a short while, they convinced both their audience and themselves that the performance was real. But a legacy is not a costume that can be put on. It is a living thing that must be tended, and David and Clara were not gardeners. They were strip miners. The first and most heartbreaking casualty was the rose garden. Thomas Richardson's masterpiece, a living library of scent and color, was an expense Clara deemed frivolous. The expert gardener, who had tended the bushes for 30 years, was dismissed as an unnecessary cost. "How hard can it be to water some flowers?" she had scoffed. She soon found out. Without his knowledgeable hands to prune, to feed, to protect against blight and pests, the garden began its slow, sad decline. Weeds choked the meticulously kept beds. Black spot appeared on the leaves of the prize-winning hybrid teas. The climbing roses on the trellis grew wild and tangled, their blooms becoming smaller and sparser with each passing season. The air at Rosewood Manor, once perfumed with the scent of 100 different roses, now carried the faint, bitter smell of decay. The death of the garden was a potent symbol for the state of the entire estate. It was a beautiful, complex inheritance that required expertise and love, and they had neither. Their incompetence bled into every aspect of the property. A small leak in the roof of the east wing was ignored until it became a torrent, staining the plaster and ruining an antique rug. The grand, century-old boiler, which required careful annual maintenance, began to sputter and fail, leaving the cavernous house drafty and cold in the winter. They spent a fortune on a new imported sports car for David and a top-of-the-line kitchen for Clara, but they balked at the cost of repainting the home's peeling exterior. From a distance, Rosewood Manor still looked impressive, but up close, the neglect was painfully obvious. It was like a beautiful woman dressed in a fine gown, but with a sickness festering just beneath her skin. To fund their lavish lifestyle, David, with Clara's constant encouragement, decided he was a natural businessman. He launched a series of ill-conceived ventures. He tried to convert the old carriage house into a craft distillery, investing a significant sum in copper stills and oak barrels, only to discover the Byzantine world of permits and licensing was more than his charm could handle. The project was abandoned, the expensive equipment left to gather dust. Next, Clara decided they should market the estate as a high-end wedding venue. They spent thousands on a glossy website, but they had no experience in hospitality. The few events they did book were disasters, marred by poor service and the decaying state of the grounds, leading to scathing online reviews that torpedoed the business before it ever truly launched. Each failure was a fresh wound to David's fragile ego and a bigger drain on their dwindling resources. The social currency they had so desperately sought began to devalue as well. The local community, the families who had known and respected Thomas and Eleanor, saw through their gaudy displays. They noticed the dying gardens. They heard the rumors of unpaid local contractors. The invitations to their parties were politely declined more and more often. The string quartet was eventually replaced by a Bluetooth speaker, the fine champagne by cheaper Prosecco. Their circle of friends shrank until all that was left were people as shallow and transactional as they were. The pressure began to crack the facade of their perfect marriage. The late-night whispers that had once been filled with conspiratorial plotting now became bitter, resentful arguments. "I thought you knew how to run a business," Clara would hiss, her voice stripped of all its sweetness. "I'm doing my best," David would retort, his voice cracking with the strain. "This house, it just eats money. It's not my fault." They were two thieves, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, starting to realize that the treasure they had stolen was turning to dust in their hands. All the while, Eleanor lived in the heart of the decay, blissfully unaware. Clara made sure her mother-in-law's suite of rooms was kept pristine. It was a perfect, isolated stage set where she could continue to play the role of devoted caretaker whenever it was required. Eleanor would sit in her beautifully appointed room, looking out the window, her clouded mind unable to register that the vibrant tapestry of roses she remembered was now a tangle of brown thorns and weeds. The contrast was a chilling metaphor for their stewardship. They were masters of the surface, of the immediate, visible performance, but utterly ignorant of the foundational health of the legacy they had seized. The money continued to drain away. They took out a second mortgage on the house, a desperate move that bought them a few more months of denial. They began selling off the very antiques Clara had so carefully cataloged in her mind when she first arrived. A grandfather clock that had chimed the hours for a century was sold to pay a credit card bill. A silver tea service was liquidated to cover the taxes. They were cannibalizing the very prize they had committed treason to win. One evening, Clara stood alone in the vast, ostentatious living room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. On the polished glass table in front of her was not a vase of fresh flowers, but a stack of crimson-stamped, overdue bills. The look on her face was not one of triumph. It was the tight-drawn mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The paradise they had stolen had become their prison, and they were beginning to understand that the walls were closing in, slowly, surely, and with no escape in sight. The gilded cage that Clara and David had built for themselves was always a fragile construction, but the event that shattered it came not from a bill collector or a foreclosure notice, but from the terrifying silence of a Sunday morning. David had gone into Eleanor's suite to bring her the morning paper and found her slumped in her armchair, one side of her face slack, her eyes wide with a terror she could not articulate. A thin thread of drool trickled from the corner of her mouth. The panic was immediate and absolute. The facade of serene control Clara had maintained for years cracked, revealing the raw, screeching fear beneath. The ambulance ride was a blur of wailing sirens and medical jargon. The local hospital, a sterile, beige purgatory, where they were forced to wait, stripped of their status as masters of the manor and reduced to just another pair of frightened relatives in an uncomfortable waiting room. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was a death by 1,000 cuts. Eleanor had suffered a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, the doctor explained in a tired, dispassionate voice. They had stabilized her, but the event had triggered a cascade of neurological damage, accelerating her underlying dementia at an alarming rate. He spoke of her condition as a complex, aggressive decline. There are some advanced therapies, he said, flipping through Eleanor's chart, experimental treatments, targeted neurological programs. But they're only available at major research institutions, places in Boston or New York. He then looked up at them over the top of his glasses, his expression a mixture of pity and pragmatism. And I have to be honest with you, they are astronomically expensive. We'll do our best to make her comfortable here, of course. His words hung in the air, a polite but firm declaration of their hopelessness. We have reached the limits of what people like you can afford. The doctor's words echoed in the grim silence of the hospital cafeteria. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, a perfect match for the taste of ashes in Clara's mouth. For the first time, she and David were confronted with a problem that could not be solved by charm, by manipulation, or by selling another piece of their stolen inheritance. This was a problem that required actual, liquid capital, and they had none. The second mortgage had been a foolish gamble that hadn't paid off. Their credit cards were stretched to their absolute limits. The sale of the antiques had been just enough to keep the electricity on and put gas in their luxury cars. They were house-rich and cash-destitute, the owners of a decaying palace who couldn't afford a life raft. The reality of their colossal failure settled upon them with a crushing, physical weight. They had stolen a kingdom, only to find themselves paupers within its walls, unable to even care for the queen whose crown they had so callously taken. Desperation is the mother of invention, and for a mind like Clara's, it was also the fuel for frantic late-night research. If they couldn't solve the problem with their own resources, they would have to find another way. Foregoing sleep, she sat in the dim light of a hospital waiting room, her laptop balanced on her knees, frantically typing names and phrases into the search bar. Top geriatric neurologists, East Coast. Advanced dementia treatment centers. Clinical trials, neurological decline. One name kept appearing in connection with the most cutting-edge research. A doctor, Aris Thorne, head of the Thorne Institute for Neurodegenerative Disorders, a world-renowned and ferociously exclusive facility in Boston. This was the place. This was the doctor who could save Eleanor. But the Institute's website made it clear that access was nearly impossible, reserved for the immensely wealthy or the scientifically unique. As she clicked through the Institute's website, a cold knot of despair tightening in her stomach, she decided to look at the administration page, perhaps to find a contact for financial aid. She scrolled through the list of names and titles: Chief of Staff, Head of Research, director of philanthropy. And then she saw it, a name that made the air rush from her lungs. Amelia Richardson, Senior Grants Administrator, Patient Liaison. She stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't just the name, it was the title, Patient Liaison. It was a title that meant power, it meant access. It meant that the quiet, bookish sister-in-law she had dismissed and discarded held the keys to the very kingdom they needed to enter. In the years they had been squandering their inheritance, Amelia had been silently, diligently building an empire of her own, an empire of influence and connection in the one field that could now save them. The irony was so vicious, so profoundly cruel, it was almost poetic. She showed the screen to David. His face went pale, a sickly, greenish white, under the fluorescent lights. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Absolutely not. We can't, Clara. We can't ask her. She'll hang up. She'll laugh at us. She has every right to." For a moment, Clara's own pride flared. The thought of begging Amelia, of groveling before the woman she had so thoroughly vanquished, was a humiliation almost too great to bear. But then she glanced through the waiting room door towards the hallway that led to Eleanor's room, and the pragmatist in her took over. Pride was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. "Don't be a fool, David," she snapped, her voice a harsh whisper. "This isn't about us. Do you think I want to do this? This is about your mother. She is lying in a bed in a second-rate hospital, and her brain is shutting down. Your sister, whether we like it or not, can get her in front of the best doctor on the planet. Are you really going to let your pride stand in the way of that?" She knew exactly which buttons to push, framing his cowardice as a betrayal of his mother, recasting their desperate, selfish need as a noble sacrifice. He crumpled, as he always did. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "Okay, you call her." He couldn't even bear to do it himself. The burden of their surrender, like every other burden, would fall to her. Clara walked to a deserted hallway, her heels clicking a nervous rhythm on the linoleum floor. She took out her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She found Amelia's number, unblocked from a contact list that had been dormant for years. She rehearsed the words in her head, trying to strike the perfect balance of contrition, sisterly concern, and desperation. She had to sound broken, not demanding. She had to appeal to the part of Amelia she had once exploited, her sense of duty, her love for her mother. She pressed the call button, her heart pounding against her ribs with each ring. 1 ring, 2, 3. She was about to hang up when the ringing stopped. There was a click, and then silence. For a second, she thought no one was there. "Hello?" Amelia's voice finally came, cool, steady, and utterly unreadable. It was the voice of a stranger. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing the last bitter remnants of her pride. "Amelia?" she began, her own voice sounding thin and pathetic in her ears. "Hi, it's Clara. I know it's been a long time." She paused, hoping for a response, but got only silence. She pushed on, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I wouldn't be calling, but it's Mom. She's not well, Amy. She had an episode. She's here at the local hospital and the doctors. They don't know what to do." She took a shaky breath, preparing for the final, humiliating plea. "Amy, I know we've had our differences. I know we have. But she is your mother, too. We need your help. Please." The word hung in the sterile air of the hospital corridor, a raw, desperate confession of her complete and utter defeat. The silence that answered Clara's desperate plea was a weapon in itself. It stretched for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. In the sterile quiet of the hospital corridor, each second was an eternity, a space in which Clara's carefully constructed composure crumbled into dust. She could hear her own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of her heart. She was about to speak again, to beg, when Amelia's voice finally returned, as calm and cool as the surface of a frozen lake. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all. It was the voice of a disinterested administrator. "Give me the specifics," Amelia said. What were her vital signs upon admission? What medications are they giving her? What is the attending physician's name? The questions were so professional, so detached from the raw, personal drama of the situation, that Clara was completely disarmed. She stammered, momentarily wrong-footed, before relaying the information she had, her voice a jumble of half-understood medical terms. On the other end of the line, in her quiet, minimalist apartment, Amelia sat at her desk with a pen and a legal pad. She listened, her expression unreadable, and took meticulous notes. Each question she asked was sharp, precise, and demonstrated a fluency in the world of medicine that Clara found deeply intimidating. Has she had an MRI or a CT scan? What were the preliminary findings? Who is managing her case? It was not a conversation between estranged sisters-in-law, it was an intake interview, and Clara was the terrified, unqualified applicant. This cold professionalism was more unnerving than any screaming match could have been. It repositioned Amelia not as the victim, but as the authority, the expert in a field where Clara was utterly, hopelessly lost. After several minutes of this clinical interrogation, Amelia fell silent again. Clara held her breath. "Dr. Eris Thorne is the best," Amelia stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. "His patient list is closed. The waiting list for a consultation is over 3 years long. The Institute rarely takes external transfers from regional hospitals." Each sentence was a hammer blow, systematically destroying the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in Clara's chest. Then, after another calculated pause, Amelia delivered the words Clara was desperate to hear. "However," she said, her tone unchanged, given the acute nature of the situation, "I may be able to present her case to the weekly review board. There is a small chance they would make an exception." Hope, bright, blinding, and beautiful, surged through Clara's veins. "Oh, Amelia, thank you," she gushed. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it. Thank you." "It's not that simple, Clara," Amelia cut in, her voice instantly quashing the other woman's relief. "The Institute has protocols, very strict protocols. If I am to champion this case, everything has to be done perfectly, by the book. There can be no ambiguities. Are you listening carefully?" "Yes," Clara breathed. "Yes, of course." This was the moment. The culmination of years of silent planning, the spring of a trap 2 years in the making. First, Amelia began, her voice the epitome of bureaucratic efficiency. "The Institute's legal department is adamant about dealing with a single point of contact for patient care. To avoid any confusion or conflicting decisions, especially in complex guardianship cases, they require a single, legally designated medical authority. Before I can even submit the initial paperwork, you and David will need to sign a formal transfer of medical power of attorney, giving me sole and exclusive authority over all of Mother's healthcare decisions. It's standard procedure. Just a piece of hospital red tape to streamline the process." She let the words sink in. A transfer of power. In any other context, Clara's internal alarms would have been screaming. But Amelia's framing was perfect. It wasn't a demand, it was a requirement of the system, a box to be ticked. It sounded logical, even sensible. Before Clara could fully process the implications, Amelia continued, moving seamlessly to the second, more critical condition. "Secondly, and this is a financial matter, many of Dr. Thorne's treatments are experimental and fall outside of traditional insurance coverage. My department is responsible for securing institutional grants and financial assistance for qualifying patients. To do that, the Finance Committee requires a complete and transparent accounting of the patient's financial situation." She paused. "I will need a comprehensive, sworn, and notarized statement from you as the current holder of the general power of attorney. It must detail the complete management of Mother's estate from the moment you assumed control. A full accounting of all major expenditures, sales of assets, any and all debts incurred against the estate, and its current net value. It's just a formality for the application. The committee needs it to assess eligibility for our internal support programs. A simple financial statement. A simple financial statement." The phrase was a masterpiece of understatement. Amelia had asked for a signed confession, and she had gift-wrapped it as an application for financial aid. A cold sliver of fear pierced through Clara's desperation. A full accounting? A sworn statement? But what was the alternative? To leave Eleanor to fade away in this sad, provincial hospital? To admit complete and utter defeat? Her mind raced, her innate arrogance providing the rationalization she needed. I can write it in a way that looks fine, she told herself. I can frame the expenses as necessary for the upkeep of the house. I can fudge the numbers on the value of the antiques we sold. She's an archivist, not a forensic accountant. It's just a piece of paper she needs to get us in the door. Her desperation, coupled with her profound underestimation of the woman Amelia had become, sealed her fate. She saw the conditions not as the bars of a trap, but as two irritating but necessary hurdles on the path to her salvation. "We can do that," Clara said, her voice tight but firm. She made a quick, whispered summary of the terms to David, who stood beside her looking pale and defeated. He just nodded numbly, a passenger in a car he had long since lost control of. "Yes, Amelia," Clara said, turning her attention back to the phone. "We'll sign whatever you need. Just tell us what to do. I'll have the necessary documents drafted and sent to you by courier tomorrow," Amelia replied, her voice still maddeningly calm. "Sign them, have them notarized, and send them back. Once I have them, I will see what can be done." And with a polite, "Goodbye, Clara," she ended the call. Clara leaned against the cool wall of the hospital, the phone still pressed to her ear, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. She had done it. She had humbled herself, and it had worked. She had secured a lifeline. In her apartment, Amelia placed her phone gently back in its cradle. Her face was a placid, unreadable mask. She felt no joy, no thrill of victory. She felt only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a complex plan perfectly executed. She turned to her computer and began to compose an email, not to anyone at the hospital, but to her private attorney. The subject line was simple: Richardson Estate, action required. The email was brief and to the point, instructing him to draw up 2 ironclad legal documents, a full and irrevocable transfer of medical guardianship, and a template for a sworn financial affidavit, worded with the precision of a prosecutor, demanding specifics on dates, values, and justifications for every major transaction related to the Rosewood Manor estate for the past 3 years. She attached a list of questions she wanted embedded in the affidavit, each one a carefully aimed dart designed to expose their lies and incompetence. She hit send. The trap, baited with their own desperation and their mother's life, had been set. All she had to do now was wait for the satisfying, inevitable snap of it closing. The courier arrived on a Tuesday, bearing a thick, intimidatingly official envelope. Inside, the documents were exactly as Amelia had described, dense with legal jargon that made David's eyes glaze over. But Clara, with a lawyer's eye for loopholes and a criminal's focus on the prize, read every word. The transfer of medical guardianship was a bitter pill to swallow, a formal abdication of the control she had so painstakingly acquired, but she saw it as a temporary concession. The financial affidavit was more complex. It was a template, asking for a detailed accounting of the estate's assets and liabilities. With a confidence born of arrogance, Clara spent the afternoon at the dining room table, a pot of coffee at her side, meticulously crafting a work of fiction. She massaged numbers, rephrased extravagant purchases as necessary investments, and described the sale of priceless antiques as prudent liquidation to ensure liquidity for Mrs. Richardson's ongoing care. She was building a fortress of lies on paper, convinced of its impenetrability. She signed the last page with a flourish, a triumphant smirk on her face. David signed where she told him to, his own signature, a weak, hesitant scrawl. They sent the package back, a signed and notarized confession that they believed was their ticket to salvation. 2 days later, Amelia called. Her voice was as placid and professional as ever. There was no elation, no hint of victory. "I've received the documents," she stated simply. "Thank you for your promptness. We have a final logistical step. My legal counsel needs to have a brief meeting with all of us to finalize the submission to the Institute's board. His office is in Boston. Would 10 o'clock tomorrow morning be suitable? A lawyer's office. A small cold stone of unease dropped into Clara's stomach, but she pushed it away. This was the final hurdle. They were so close. Of course, she said, forcing a cheerful tone. We'll be there. David agreed without a word, his expression one of weary resignation. He was a man being led to his own execution, too tired to even question the route. The law office of Harrison and Croft was nothing like the strip mall practice of the lawyer Clara had used to hijack the estate. It was old Boston money, a world of hushed corridors, polished mahogany, and the faint, pleasant scent of leather and paper. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of legal precedent. They were shown into a large, wood-paneled conference room. At the far end of a long, gleaming table sat Amelia, and beside her, a distinguished, silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit. He rose as they entered. "Mr. and Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "I am Marcus Harrison. Please, have a seat." Amelia nodded at them, her expression a blank slate. There was no warmth in her eyes, but no malice either. Just a quiet, unnerving stillness. Clara and David sat, the rich leather of the chairs feeling cold against their skin. They expected him to produce a final hospital form for them to sign. Instead, Mr. Harrison placed a single, familiar document in the center of the table. It was their financial affidavit. "We have a few points of clarification before we can proceed," he began, his eyes fixed on Clara. "In this sworn statement, which you signed and had notarized 2 days ago, you attest that the estate's finances have been managed in a way that prioritizes the long-term care of Eleanor Richardson and the preservation of the core asset. Is that correct?" "Yes, of course," Clara said, her voice a little too high. Harrison nodded slowly. He then produced a second set of papers, a slim file filled with glossy photographs and auction records. "That's curious," he continued, his tone dangerously mild, "because in this section here, you state that you sold a George III grandfather clock for, and I quote, prevailing market value of $15,000. Our own investigation, however, found that the clock was sold 3 months ago to a private dealer for $5,000 in cash. Its appraised value, according to the auction house that handled a similar piece from the same maker last year, is closer to $75,000. He let the number hang in the air. The law has a term for such a discrepancy in a sworn statement. It's called perjury. Clara's face went white. A strangled noise escaped her throat. That's a mistake. An appraisal error. Before she could formulate a better lie, Amelia spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension like a shard of ice. "My father was not a man who made mistakes," she said. She slid 2 more items across the polished table, her father's leather-bound journal, and the thick manila envelope containing his final letter. "He saw this coming," Amelia said softly. "He saw you, Clara." Mr. Harrison picked up the letter. "I believe this is the relevant passage," he said, and began to read from Thomas Richardson's will, a document they had never known existed. He read the clause about the Rosewood Trust, about the true family fortune, and about the very specific conditions required to activate it. Irrefutable proof of gross financial mismanagement or a demonstrable act of bad faith. When he finished, he placed the letter down and looked directly at Clara. The trap, so elegantly designed, so patiently set, finally sprang. "The financial affidavit you signed, Mrs. Richardson," Harrison said, his voice now cold and hard as granite, "was not an application for financial aid for your mother-in-law. It was, in fact, the final piece of evidence my client needed. It is a detailed, notarized, and legally binding confession, in your own words and with your own signature, of the very gross financial mismanagement required to execute the terms of the Rosewood Trust. You have, of your own free will, provided my client with the key to the entire Richardson fortune. A fortune you never even knew existed." The world tilted. For a moment, Clara just stared, her mind refusing to process the sheer, catastrophic scale of her miscalculation. Then, the denial shattered, and a primal rage took its place. "You tricked me," she shrieked, bolting to her feet, her voice echoing in the quiet, wood-paneled room. "This is entrapment. It's illegal. You used a sick old woman. You used your own mother." Amelia rose slowly to meet her gaze. And for the first time in years, the mask of calm indifference fell away, revealing the white-hot core of her pain and fury. "I used my mother?" she said, her voice low and trembling with controlled power. "You stood in my home and told me my mother, in a moment of clarity she no longer possessed, wanted to write me out of her life. You used her failing mind to steal my past and my future. You used her love for her son to poison him against his own sister. You banished me and left me with nothing but the clothes on my back. You saw a vulnerable, sick woman and used her as a key to a house." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into Clara's. "I see that same sick woman, and I am using your greed, your incompetence, and your monstrous ego as the key to save her from you. We are not the same." The force of Amelia's words, the undeniable truth of them, struck David like a physical blow. While Clara stood, sputtering with impotent rage, David simply broke. A loud, ragged sob tore from his throat, a sound of utter and complete devastation. He slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, his body shaking. "She's right," he wept, the words muffled by his hands. "Clara, she's right. It's all true. We did it. I'm sorry, Amy. God, I'm so sorry." His confession, loud and pathetic in the solemn office, was the final, ugly nail in their coffin. It was over. Clara stared at her weeping, broken husband, then back at the cold, resolute face of her sister-in-law, and she finally understood. This was not a negotiation, it was an execution, and she had just handed the executioner the axe. The sound of David's broken sobs filled the oppressive silence of the conference room. He was a hollowed-out man, a collapsed structure of guilt and weakness. Clara stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage, her schemes and ambitions lying in a smoldering heap at her feet. The beautiful, intricate web she had woven had become her own straitjacket. Mr. Harrison, the calm center of the storm, let the confession hang in the air for a long moment before he spoke, his voice leaving no room for argument. "What you have just heard," he said, his gaze sweeping over both of them, "is a verbal corroboration of a crime. Combined with the paper trail of financial mismanagement and the fraudulent affidavit you signed, we have a compelling case to bring before the district attorney." He steepled his fingers, the picture of detached authority. The charges would be severe. Financial exploitation of the elderly, a first-degree felony in this state. Conspiracy to commit fraud. And, of course, the perjury you committed in your sworn statement. Given the scale of the assets involved and the vulnerability of the victim, you would be facing significant jail time. Both of you. The threat of prison, of public humiliation, of their names and faces splashed across the local news, was the final, brutal blow. Clara visibly flinched. The world she had fought so desperately to conquer, the world of status and respectability, would turn on her with a vengeance. It was at that moment, with their ruin laid bare and their fate hanging by a thread, that Amelia finally presented her terms. She was not interested in the blunt instrument of the state's justice. Her punishment would be far more personal, far more precise. "I have no desire to see my brother in prison," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth or pity. "And I have no desire to drag our family name, my father's name, through a public scandal. My goal is not to punish you, but to rectify what you have done. So, I am going to offer you a choice." She gestured to Mr. Harrison, who slid 2 neat piles of documents to the center of the table. "Option A," Amelia continued, "is that you refuse my offer, in which case, Mr. Harrison will forward his entire file to the district attorney's office this afternoon. The legal process will take its course. You will lose everything. David will be formally disinherited, and you will both likely serve time in prison. Your lives as you know them will be over." She let that sink in, watching the last vestiges of color drain from Clara's face. "Or," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "you can choose option B, right here, right now." She pointed to the first pile of documents. "This is a quitclaim deed. By signing it, you will immediately and irrevocably transfer full ownership of Rosewood Manor back to me. It will be legally recorded as a repayment against the funds you have embezzled from the estate." She then pointed to the second, much thicker, document. "This is a legally binding agreement. By signing it, David, you will voluntarily place your entire share of any and all future inheritance from our mother into a protected, third-party trust to be managed by Mr. Harrison's firm. Those funds will be used exclusively for her medical care at the Thorne Institute or any other facility I deem appropriate. You will have no access to it. You will have no say in how it is spent. You will, for all intents and purposes, be financially disinherited, not by a court, but by your own hand." The genius of her justice was in its exquisite cruelty. Jail would have been a punishment inflicted upon them. This was a punishment they would be forced to inflict upon themselves. It was an act of ritual surrender, a complete and total abdication of the prize they had sold their souls to obtain. They would not be able to cast themselves as victims of the system. They would be the architects of their own undoing, forced to sign the very papers that unwound their entire conspiracy. It was a humiliation far deeper and more lasting than any prison sentence. David, his face streaked with tears, reached for the papers without hesitation. He didn't even read them. He just wanted the agony to end. He took the pen Mr. Harrison offered and signed his name, his hand shaking so violently the signature was barely legible. He signed away the house. He signed away his birthright. He signed away the last of his self-respect. But Clara was not so easily broken. Her pride, the very engine of her ambition, made one final, desperate stand. "You can't do this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You expect us to just sign away everything and walk away with nothing?" Amelia looked at her, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary finality. "No, Clara, you are mistaken. You are not walking away with nothing. You are walking away with your freedom. You are walking away without a criminal record. I am allowing you to escape the consequences of your own actions. This," she said, gesturing to the papers, "is not my price. This is my gift to you. It is far more mercy than you ever showed me. Sign it, or don't. The choice is yours." Mr. Harrison has the DA's number on his desk. For a long, tense moment, Clara's eyes blazed with a furious, cornered animal hatred. She looked at the papers, then at her broken husband, then at the calm, implacable face of her sister-in-law. And she saw the truth. There was no escape. There was no move left to make. She had been utterly comprehensively outplayed. With a sound that was half sob, half snarl, she snatched the pen from the table. Her signature, unlike David's, was a sharp, angry gash across the page, the final, violent act of a defeated tyrant. They left the office in a stunned, funereal silence. They had walked in that morning as the proud, if panicked, owners of a grand estate. They walked out as trespassers in their own lives, stripped bare, possessing nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of their failure. As the heavy office door clicked shut behind them, Amelia finally allowed herself to exhale, a long, slow breath she felt she had been holding for years. Mr. Harrison quietly gathered the signed documents, stacking them into a neat, triumphant pile. "You were remarkable, Amelia," he said softly. "Your father would have been very proud." Amelia looked down at the deeds, at the signatures that represented the end of her long war. She felt no joy, no giddy sense of victory, only a profound, quiet, and deeply weary sense of closure. Her first call was not to a real estate agent or a locksmith. It was to the admissions department at the Thorne Institute. With the full legal and financial authority she now possessed, she formally began the process of having her mother transferred. In that moment, the truth of her long game was made clear. Rosewood Manor was never the prize. It was the leverage. The confession was not for revenge. It was for the resources it unlocked. All of it, every patient step, every calculated risk, every sleepless night, had been for one purpose: to reclaim her mother from the clutches of her captors and give her the care she deserved. Justice, for Amelia, was not a fiery explosion of retribution. It was the cold, quiet, and perfectly balanced work of an equation. And on that day, in that solemn, wood-paneled office, every variable had been solved, every debt had been paid, and the final sum was, at long last, her own. Amelia Richardson's justice was not a storm of fire and vengeance. It was a cold, quiet, and meticulously arranged new reality. She did not throw David and Clara out of Rosewood Manor. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, she allowed them to stay, but not as masters. They were moved from the opulent master suite into the small, Spartan servants' quarters at the back of the house, a two-room apartment above the garage that had not been occupied in 50 years. They were ghosts at a feast, forced to live in the shadow of the life they had stolen. From their small windows, they had a perfect view of the main house. They watched as Amelia hired a team of restoration experts, not to modernize, but to carefully undo the damage Clara had wrought, painstakingly returning the house to its former, quiet grace. They were given a small, humiliating stipend from the trust, enough for groceries and basic necessities, but nothing more. They were prisoners in paradise. Their punishment, not a locked door, but the daily, inescapable reminder of everything they had gained and then, so spectacularly, lost. Amelia's first priority was not the house, but its heart. She rehired the old gardener, a man named George, whose hands understood the language of the roses as well as her father once had. Together, they began the slow, arduous work of reclaiming the gardens from the weeds and neglect. Amelia would spend her weekends working alongside him, her hands in the rich soil, finding a quiet therapy in the methodical work. She learned to prune the deadwood, to treat the black spot, to nurture the struggling roots back to life. As the first new, vibrant crimson blooms began to appear on the Mr. Lincoln bush, she felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. She was not just restoring a garden, she was healing a legacy, proving that what is broken can be made beautiful again, with patience and care. While Rosewood Manor was slowly coming back to life, Amelia focused on her mother. With the full financial power of the Rosewood Trust at her command, she had Eleanor transferred to a private room at the Thorne Institute. It wasn't a hospital, it was a sanctuary, a beautiful facility with sun-drenched rooms, serene gardens, and the best neurological care team in the world. Amelia visited 3 times a week, driving the long hours from the coast to Boston without complaint. Most days, her mother was lost in the familiar fog, her eyes vacant, her conversation a looping track of fragmented memories. Amelia would simply sit with her, holding her hand, reading aloud from her favorite books of poetry. She expected nothing in return. Her victory in the lawyer's office was not for her own sake. It was for the simple, profound privilege of these quiet moments, of ensuring her mother's final years were ones of dignity, comfort, and peace. The twist, the final, heart-stopping turn in the story, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon about 6 months later. Amelia was sitting by her mother's bed, reading a poem by Emily Dickinson. The room was quiet, the only sound, the gentle patter of rain against the large window. Eleanor, who had been silent all day, suddenly squeezed her daughter's hand. The pressure was surprisingly firm, insistent. Amelia stopped reading and looked at her. The fog in her mother's eyes was gone. For the first time in years, they were sharp, clear, and filled with a deep, ancient sadness. She looked directly at Amelia, a look of profound, lucid recognition. "Your father," Eleanor whispered, her voice a dry rustle, but every word perfectly clear, he always said, "A rose bush, to grow strong, you have to prune the sick branches." Her eyes welled with tears, a single drop tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "I'm sorry, my child," she breathed, her grip tightening on Amelia's hand. "I am so sorry that you had to be the gardener." Amelia stared, her own heart seeming to stop in her chest. The words replayed in her mind, unlocking a truth so deep and devastating it rearranged the entire history of her pain. Her mother had not been a completely passive victim. She had not been an oblivious pawn in Clara's game. In the fading light of her own mind, she had seen it. She had seen the sickness in her son, the rot of his weakness, the blight of his wife's ambition. And perhaps out of guilt for her own role in spoiling him, perhaps out of a mother's final, desperate hope for his redemption through fire, she had allowed it. She had been too weak to stop them, but she had held onto a sliver of faith in the strength of her daughter. It had not been a test that she said, but a terrible, tragic crucible that she had permitted, hoping that her strongest child would be strong enough to save the family from the weakest. The betrayal had not just been from a brother and a sister-in-law, it had been a silent, heartbreaking concession from a mother who saw no other way. Amelia left the institute that day, a changed woman. She stood in the newly thriving rose garden at Rosewood Manor as the sun began to set, the air thick with the perfume of blossoms. She finally understood. Her father had left her a weapon. Her mother had given her permission to use it. Her long, silent years of suffering had not been a period of victimhood, but a time of sharpening that weapon. She looked over towards the small lights that had come on in the servants' quarters, where the two sick branches of her family tree were living out their quiet, pathetic exile. She felt no hatred. She felt no anger. She felt only the profound, somber finality of a difficult job completed. True justice, she realized, wasn't about the giddy thrill of revenge. It was about the hard, painful, necessary work of pruning, of cutting away the parts that were killing the whole, so that what was good and true could have the space to grow again. Her story was a testament to a quiet, powerful truth. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For when they finally decide to speak, their words will not be a plea for help. They will be a verdict. Thank you for listening. Join us next time as we explore another story of the secrets and sorrows hidden behind the closed doors of family life.